I'm Yvonne Hamoud, registered social worker and owner of New Moon Counseling. But out of the office, I'm a mom, wife, daughter, sister, and friend. Join me each week as I sit with a special guest to discuss everyday things that impact our mental health. We'll be chatting about everything from mental health and relationships to media and current events, as well as personal experiences and reflections, all in the hopes of normalizing our humanness and helping you see that you're not alone. This is Outside the Therapy Room. Hi everyone, welcome to Outside the Therapy Room. Today we are joined by Tonya again from Clarity Counseling and Mediation. Hi Tonya.
Hi Yvonne.
How are you?
I'm good. It's great to be back again.
It's great to have you back. Today we are talking about couples therapy, but kind of bringing a new spin into our conversation about couples therapy, because I feel like it's obviously an important topic. At both of our practices, we offer couples therapy, and sometimes there can be some misinformation out there. So we're here to kind of bust some of those myths. And hopefully provide folks with some information on couples therapy if that is something that you are looking for.
Yeah. We're always getting asked lots of questions on what it looks like and the different areas that counseling or relationship counseling can address. So I think it's a great topic for today.
Yeah, and we do, I think we mentioned it before we started recording, but like in movies and in media, sometimes couples counseling is just kind of seen one way as one of the myths that we're going to talk about today. So yeah, we'll kind of address all of those myths and questions in this podcast. But let's start with the myth that I think is in media is talked about a little bit more, which is that couples therapy is only for crisis situations or only kind of like a last resort to making a relationship work. And I feel like that's a huge myth because while yes, some people are coming into couples therapy because, they have had a long time of struggle, of disconnection. They may be coming to couples therapy for support in that to kind of try to rebuild their relationship. That's not the only reason why people come to couples therapy. And so, big myth.
Yeah, I think, I've been doing this for more than 10 years now. And definitely when I first started supporting couples and relationships really of all kinds, it seemed to be really accessed primarily when couples were in a position of breaking down and there was a crisis going on. I would say that more and more, it's getting more and more common for people to reach out more preventatively, more for maintenance. I know one of the couples that I've supported for a long time, I remember on the notes that they had made for their initial appointment, they were very clear that they were very happily married. They were not in a crisis. And I had to chuckle because they referenced Dax Shepard and Kristen Bell and how the two of them frequently talk about just how they use therapy, sometimes even for date night, but just to have someone that's unbiased and that's able to listen to what's going on and to have a third party to maybe build in some skills or teach them some strategies that are going to help their relationship grow and flourish. So I think that's really becoming a lot more common versus the whole crisis piece. And I always say to people, it really ideally the best time to start any therapy is when things are going okay. Right? Because it can be anxiety producing for a lot of people to start counseling to find the right fit in the therapist. And if you're able to do that when things are relatively calm, then when things go sideways, you already have that relationship established. And then you reach out and you're kind of 10 steps ahead of the game.
Yeah. I also think a lot of the times when we are in a calmer place, when we're starting therapy, especially couples therapy or family therapy, you're not so kind of defensive or coming in with like a list of things you want to fix your partner, you want the therapist to fix your partner on.
Exactly.
You're kind of more on a level ground of being like, hey, let's work through this together. And as you mentioned, then you have the tools in your back pocket for when there is a heated conversation or there is some conflict in the relationship. But I love Dax Shepard and Kristen Bell. They do talk about it a lot in his on his podcast. And I think it is just, having a third party recognize your patterns
Hmm.
and maybe what or how you can approach conversations with your partner in a different way.
Hmm.
It really does only help to rebuild that relationship and feel a little bit more secure and comfortable when we have to have maybe, the awkward or uncomfortable conversations like, I don't like that you did this today, or, I felt this way when this thing happened. And
Hmm.
I think especially when our, couples grow into parenting,
Hmm.
then there can be some of that disconnection. There can be more, maybe not more conflict, but maybe moments of disagreement when
Hmm.
there's different expectations of what those new roles are going to look like. And
Hmm.
so that again is a great example of, coming to therapy for preventative measures. And I think we've had a lot of clients come in for premarital counseling. We've had couples come in because they are planning or expecting a child. And so just kind of having that, you know, scheduled time
Hmm.
to have those conversations on, their worries, their anxieties of how their relationship is going to change when this new life stage happens, that can be really supportive. And it's, again, you're committing though, like that hour into your relationship,
Yeah.
and it can turn into date night if you go and grab dinner or coffee afterwards, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, especially folks with, young kids, a lot of times I've had them refer to it as their date night, right?
Yeah.
And again, I always laugh. Maybe it's not the, the most fun date night,
The most
but the
romantic
most
date night.
romantic date
Yeah.
night. Yeah. But also it is a commitment, and
Yeah.
it is building in um, to your relationship. And it's not the goal of relationship therapy or couples counseling is not, to attack your partner. It's not to focus on the negative.
Hmm.
It's to, you know, hopefully bring up things that are important, or things that are, relationships are always in flux. And um, he, being able to have, space and the time to look at the other person's perspective and hear the other
Hmm.
person's perspective, and also have them hear yours, right? And
Hmm.
I think that a lot of times life gets really busy and we're going really fast, and it's hard
Yeah.
to have that dedicated time to be able to do that. And so it's a space where uh, couples are able to maybe have some support with co-regulation, so that
Hmm.
they have the capacity to be able to talk about things that are important to them, and then
Yeah.
um, yeah, learn some tips and tricks to be able to uh, take outside of the session and to practice. I always say to my clients, like, think of it as like an experiment, right?
Hmm.
It might work, it might not work, but unless we try um, even subtle shifts to some of the things that we're doing, whether it's how we're bringing up um, concerns,
Hmm.
or we're having questions for our partner, um, language can be really important.
Yeah.
How we're prefacing some of those conversations, how we're taking the time to listen or to be curious to what our partner is saying in response to that.
Hmm.
That can have a really big impact on the trajectory of those conversations. And
Hmm.
we're not born, innately having those skills. So
Yeah.
counseling can be a great way to be able to do that. And the goal is to leave connected, right? It's
Yeah.
not a one and done. I don't know of many therapists who, their claim to fame is you're going to come one time and you're going to be
And
good to
then that's
go.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not really realistic, but it's baby steps, and what can you learn and take away from. And I know a lot of couples that I support, again, it's the fact of both attending one appointment
Hmm.
really demonstrates the commitment that you have to each other,
Yeah.
and to your relationship, which feels good. I
Hmm.
think that's a connecting activity for many people.
Yeah. And what I tell a lot of my couples is you've chosen to be together,
Hmm.
but sometimes having the opportunity to understand how someone processes different information, that we don't always know, because a
Yeah.
lot of that is because of how we were raised, our experiences, our connections with other people. And so we may perceive a situation that we felt was harmless, and
Hmm.
and our partner might view that differently. And that's where that understanding of, this is how I interpreted this situation, like that can be so helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's where having a therapist in the room can be helpful to
For sure.
draw out some of that information that we don't even realize, those default patterns of behavior that are based on our families of origin or what's been
Yeah.
modeled to us, right? And
Yeah.
a lot of times I'll ask each of the people in the room to discuss, what their interpretation is, or what thoughts and feelings come up for them as a result of what their partner has just said, or how they're feeling it in their body. So I think that multiple truths exist. It can be uncomfortable at first to have that third party in the room,
Hmm.
kind of bearing witness to what's going on in your relationship. But once, trust has been established and, uh, you know, there's some comfort there, it can be really helpful just to be able to hear. Sometimes it's hard to see when you're kind of in the thick of things, right?
Yeah.
So to have somebody that's um, outside of your relationship kind of looking in and being able to ask things curiously, right? Or
Hmm.
to slow things down a bit if people are getting activated or flooded um, in their bodies as a result of something their partner said or the
Hmm.
topic at hand.
And having that observation, like a blank slate therapist to like come in and be able to observe
Right.
like how those conversations happen, body cues, like all of those things.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Exactly. Yeah.
So, what is another myth, which actually does impact, like, I guess, take place on the therapist end, or maybe some myths that people have about therapists?
A lot of times, I think there's the belief that therapists take sides, right? And again, I think there's some fear that if you're going to couples counseling or relationship therapy, that you're going to get attacked, right?
Mm-hmm.
Typically, there's three people in the room, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, just a reminder that therapists, a large part of their training is on triangulation and about building safety or supportive environment in the room, and that therapists are really aware and cognizant of those power dynamics, right? And
Yeah.
and I always say I'm really upfront early on in the sessions with my clients that it's not about taking sides. Everyone has their own perspective and their own truths, and we're really looking typically for common ground, right?
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, I think as therapists, we have a responsibility to not pick, like, to make sure both parties are being supported, but also not perpetuating maybe unhealthy forms of communication or conflict
Mm-hmm.
resolution. But there's definitely ways that we are trained to do so in a way that's respectful and
Mm-hmm.
collaborative and does not result in one party feeling excluded or feeling ganged up on, because
Yeah.
that's not supportive, right?
Yeah. And one other thing that I often tell my couples is the relationship is the client.
Yes.
Like that is my focus is,
Hmm.
to get your relationship to where you want it to be,
Right.
whatever that goal may be.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to note, depending on how couples therapy goes, sometimes the focus might be on one person for that session.
Hmm.
And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's that ganging up. It's trying to have that understanding be spoken out loud
Hmm.
to then be able to have, the other partner be able to be the listener and,
Hmm.
try to understand where their partner may be coming from.
Hmm.
And so what I also always tell couples, it's yes, we're not taking sides. There might be sometimes where one session is heavier focused on one and
Right.
the other, but again, the goal of the session
Hmm.
is to help the client, which is the relationship
Yeah.
as a whole.
Well, and also kind of touching on what you say, like the client, the relationship is the client. And also, I really stress with clients that whatever the issue is really the focus.
Yeah.
It's them against the issue
Yes.
versus them being separate
Hmm.
and the issue coming in between them, right? So it's
Hmm.
really them working together, not against each other, to figure out the answer to whatever the issue is, right?
Hmm.
And I was going to say, you're right. Sometimes in those sessions, it might be more heavily weighted just because whatever's being discussed on the one person.
Yeah.
And also, I think it's really important to recognize and to um, appreciate and validate the other person's experience of sitting in some of that distress and discomfort of kind of being in the hot seat, right?
Yeah.
And being vulnerable. And, again, my experience shows that is a really big example of how invested they are in that relationship and how much they care about their partner to be able to sit in that space
Yeah.
in order to address whatever's happening in that relationship.
Hmm. And I think as therapists, like you mentioned, we have that training, but we're also aware of our transference and countertransference. And
Hmm.
so we need to be the ones as therapists monitoring that. So if we do find that maybe internally we are leaning one way or another, that
Yeah.
we need to kind of put that aside to be able to be that blank slate. And we are
Hmm.
human, I think,
Absolutely.
is something we
Yeah.
definitely are expressing in this podcast, is that therapists are human.
Hmm.
And there may be feelings of our, like, from our own relationships
Hmm.
that are, coming up from what our couple is sharing. But because of the training that we have, we are
Hmm.
able to kind of separate that and be able to just hold space for our clients,
Hmm.
and trying to, figure out how we can get the issue, how we can kind of, work with our couples in a way that we can tackle the issue in a different way, in a
Hmm.
different approach. And so, yeah, I do think, like, therapists taking sides is definitely a myth. Does it happen maybe on occasion?
Hmm. I think there's
Maybe. Yeah.
parts of people's truths,
Yeah.
like it's not. Um, I think it's not as cut and dry. I can say I
Hmm.
don't think any trained therapists go into a situation without taking a side without any other information or
Yeah.
factors.
Yeah. I agree.
Um, yeah, I think that's really important. And again, I think that if there are situations where maybe we're leaning in more so to one person than the other, I think it's really important to also bring that into the room
Yeah.
so that the other person is aware of what's going on,
Hmm.
right? We're not
Hmm.
pretending that that isn't happening, because there are certain situations, I can think of, maybe where there's some, you know, unhealthy or toxic interactions that are happening
Yeah.
where um, it is a little bit more weighted towards one person and another.
Hmm.
Um, and so being able to bring that into the room in a safe way and also uh, move forward and using that example as kind of a jump off point to talk about how could that look different, how could communication
Yeah.
impact that, are there different ways of resolving that conflict that could be helpful, language, right,
Hmm.
intention versus impact,
Yeah.
perspective taking, right, there's lots of different ways to address that, um, but yeah, I mean, kind of looping back to the original myth piece of therapists take sides, I would say, as a whole, no.
Hmm.
And also, there are times where it is our responsibility to not discount people's stories, and important parts of their stories.
Yeah. So the third myth that we have here is that couples therapy is only if you plan on staying together.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had so many beautiful experiences with some of the couples I've seen
Mm-hmm.
who are coming to therapy because they are planning on separating.
Yeah.
And being able to do that in a manner that is respectful to both of them,
Mm-hmm.
that is, kind and encouraging, and all of those things, so that the separation can go as smoothly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many emotions that go on when somebody or a couple a relationship decides to go their separate ways or to
Mm-hmm.
end it. And so having that, space to process all of the emotions, divide things or
Mm-hmm.
of meaning, um, if there's children involved,
Mm-hmm.
figure out what that is going to look like in a way that both people feel safe, heard, comfortable with. Um, yeah, it's just been so like the experiences I've had have been, heavy at times,
Mm-hmm.
but for the most part, the end result has been so lovely to kind of be able to have that safe space and that, again, commitment to each other,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to do that in a way that best supports both parties. And so that is a myth that, you don't need to come to therapy only because you are planning on maintaining your relationship.
Mm-hmm.
Although that, I would say, that's the more common
Mm-hmm.
reason why people come to therapy. There are also, co-parenting, separation,
Mm-hmm.
that, some of those things are also addressed in couples therapy.
Yeah, and, discernment therapy is becoming more common
Yeah.
where I've had a few couples where, really trying to take stock of, where they came from, where they've been, and where they're going to go in the future, and not really being sure, but wanting to do it in a really thoughtful,
Hmm.
intentional way. And yeah, I think that's a really, I don't think a lot of people think about accessing therapy for those purposes,
Yeah.
right? And again, we all have friends, family, coworkers maybe that we could like run things by, but um, as we know, people typically will give advice or recommendations based on some level of how that answer is going to impact their own lives, right? So
Yeah.
that's why counseling or going to a counselor or talking to a therapist who is not going to have any of that emotional reasoning
Hmm.
taking place can be really helpful because
Hmm.
these are really big decisions, and
Yeah.
um, there's lots of things to consider. And I know in some of the discernment work that I've done with folks, sometimes it's things that they haven't really thought about, or it's not always linear, right?
Right.
So trying different things before making that final decision to either stay together or to
Hmm.
separate.
Yeah. Yeah, there have been times too when, folks have come into couples therapy and been like, if this doesn't work, we're ending. And if this does work, then
Yeah.
we'll go, which, okay, but puts a lot of pressure on the therapist.
Yeah.
But I think, folks are coming into couples therapy with the decision of, you know, we're unsure, we're trying to have
Mm-hmm.
this conversation to figure things out if things can be worked on and
Right.
improved,
Yeah.
and there's not this like ultimatum that's being put on
Mm-hmm.
couples therapy. Again, depending on whatever the outcome is, it's going to be the outcome that it is, but it's going to be, I guess, the journey to that outcome is
Right.
going to be much different,
Yeah.
because there is that space to have those uncomfortable conversations that,
Mm-hmm.
you're right, you can't really always have with the people around you, because there may
Mm-hmm.
be their own responses, their own emotions that are kind of threaded in their response to you or the advice that
Mm-hmm.
they give you.
Well, and when couples come to counseling and, kind of session one, it's really based on that kind of ultimatum vibe, right? I think it's a
Yeah.
great opportunity to talk about, some thought distortions or fear responses, right?
Yeah.
And those protective parts of us that, it's hard to be vulnerable. There's a risk if we're
Hmm.
vulnerable and it doesn't work. But also on the flip side, you know, if people are making fear based decisions and taking fear based actions because they're afraid of the relationship ending, if they don't, I always talk to couples about like, is that sustainable? Is that how does power and control
Mm.
then maybe feel comfortable in the very beginning, um, but then can lead to being unhealthy and potentially toxic, um, which can then end the relationship,
Right.
uh, you know, outside of what they originally came for, right? Because it's
Yeah.
not fun in any relationship if you're holding all the power and control. Um, I've supported people where it's like, I need to see a huge amount of change in 3 sessions,
Yeah.
and using that opportunity to be like, well, what would that look like for you, and why are those things important, and is that sustainable? Are you setting your partner or your relationship
Hmm.
up for success, or are you setting it up for failure,
Hmm.
right? And um, how is your nervous system impacting uh, the expectations that you're having from counseling?
Yeah.
Um, return on investment, right? Like you've
Hmm.
put in 20 years, you've gotten this far, 3 sessions probably isn't going to make or break it if
Right.
your intention is to genuinely explore what's going to happen in the counseling work
Hmm.
versus if someone's coming and really they're 3/4 of the way out. Yeah, which might be a good segue into reasons where couples counseling might not make sense,
Hmm.
um, or is not recommended. I know we talked a little bit about that before.
Yeah, we can talk about it after.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think there are moments where couples therapy may not be the most beneficial for
Hmm.
that relationship,
Hmm.
but
Or it may look different.
yeah, or it might look different. So stay tuned for that because we will bring that up. But continuing on with the myths.
Yeah. Several times I've had experiences where I can see that people in sessions are really hesitant of being there because they are under the belief that if they, they have had a couple other friends they've who have done couples counseling and they got divorced,
Mhm.
so that it's kind of the beginning of the end.
Yeah.
And so while there's never a guarantee that counseling will lead to successful marriages, um, again, I think it depends on uh, the intentions of the couple that are coming. If two
Mhm.
people are truly invested in working, like kind of that discernment type therapy where maybe there aren't external factors or forces at play, and maybe communication is an issue or conflict resolution is an issue, or maybe connection,
Mhm.
intimacy, those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But they're invested in the process and willing to take time, again, without a really rigid timeline.
Mhm.
Um, then I don't think there's any need to catastrophize that it's going to be the end of things, right?
Yeah.
Um, but again, I think that really is dependent on the mindset of the
Mhm.
people that are coming.
Mhm. I think again, this is one that we see a lot in media as well. That
Mhm.
you know, somebody suggests couples therapy and they take that so defensively, like their
Mhm.
relationship is doomed. That now they want it to end. But I think as we've already spoken to, like there's so much positives that can come from couples therapy, and I think in those moments where somebody or your partner
Mhm.
makes a suggestion to couples therapy, it's not always, I guess it depends on timing, first of all, but
Mhm.
it may not always be like our relationship is doomed and this is going to be the only thing that's going to fix it.
Right.
I think, if you are approaching the conversation of therapy, it's, being aware of that timing of in the middle of an argument or a fight, that may not be the best moment to be like, let's go to couples therapy
Yes.
because it might not feel so great and it's going to bring a lot of defensiveness up for
Mhm.
another partner. But I think, yeah, like relation coming to couples therapy doesn't necessarily mean that your relationship is doomed or it's
Mhm.
going to end or it's going to fail. It is an opportunity of like, hey, let's figure this out and make this work. And maybe with using different tools, a different suggestion.
Mhm.
I think a lot of the time couples come in and they're like, what we were trying to do on our own wasn't working the way we intended it.
Mhm.
And so, coming to couples therapy, hopefully it gives us a new perspective
Mhm.
or, new direction, teaches us things on how we can approach situations in a better way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I know I've talked to couples about how that's framed, right? Like there's a difference between I want to go to couples counseling because our marriage is falling apart, and if you don't go, we're going to get a divorce,
Yeah.
versus, you know, I think we can both agree things are hard, or we're struggling, or I'm feeling like things are struggling.
Like we need a
I
little
love
help
you. I care
here.
about you. I want us to strengthen
Mm-hmm.
our relationship. We don't have all the tools to do that. And because of that, and because of the love we have for one another, I really appreciate it if we could try this out, especially if
Yeah.
the other person's hesitant, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, so instead of a threat, it's more of a connection, a building into your relationship versus a
Mm-hmm.
taking away from.
Mm-hmm. And as you were mentioning, like expectations and like, I actually really love how you worded all of that because it's more as, hey, let's do this as a form of like supporting one another because
Mhm.
we are needing something else to help us understand each other a little bit better.
Yeah.
But I think the other myth that we have here is that therapy will fix everything. And while therapy can be the beginning portion of trying to understand each other better, understand patterns, learn
Hmm.
how to communicate, it's not always going to fix
No.
situations. I think there's like this um expectation that the hour that you come into
Hmm.
therapy is where all of the therapy needs to be, but no, it's so much
Most of the work is outside. Yeah.
exactly the work outside of therapy, of like your 1 hour biweekly or weekly session.
Yeah.
That's going to be the time where you're practicing what you learned during that hour,
Hmm.
where you're communicating better, where you guys are able to catch each other. Like that's the important piece.
Yeah.
And so when a client comes in, it's like, this is going to fix everything. I'm like, well, how much work are you planning on putting into this? Because it
Totally.
really will depend on you and your
Yeah.
commitment of continuing these conversations
Hmm.
or doing the exercises that were discussed in
Hmm.
therapy on your own time
Hmm.
outside of the hour session that we have.
Yeah. Looking at, again, doing experiments from the information and the skills and the strategies that you're learning
Yeah.
in that 1 hour session,
Hmm.
taking it out into the real world, trying to see what works, what doesn't work, coming back, right?
Hmm.
And seeing, okay, we tried this. And then, that's where a therapist can be really helpful to be able to kind of dig a bit deeper in how did that feel for you? How did that, what was your interpretation of that, right? A lot of times
Hmm.
in relationships, we're, especially the longer we've been in those relationships, we make our own interpretations that aren't always factual,
Yeah.
right? It's based on our own stuff. So,
Hmm.
um, but yeah, that 1 hour is a really great time to dedicated time to be able to talk through things, come up with maybe a bit of an action plan, or to again have a few more tools to walk away from. But really, unless your relationship is lived inside that therapy
Hmm.
room 24/7,
Yeah.
it's not. We need to see how does that play out in the real world, right?
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
and then really paying attention to, I always say, like, 1 degree of change at a time,
Yeah.
right? Like, what are the small successes? What made it easier to change the way you came at a conversation, where maybe you weren't happy about something
Hmm.
that was different this time? And how did that affect uh, maybe the way your partner responded this
Hmm.
time, right? So,
Yeah.
um,
And the expectations of what couples therapy is going to be, because
mhm,
both partners might be coming in with different expectations
yeah,
of what that's going to look like, what the end goal is going to be, what the result or whatever is going to be. And
absolutely.
so it's definitely important to have those conversations in therapy. But like, like if we look at it differently outside of therapy, like
Hmm.
physically, if you go to a physical trainer
Yeah,
or whatever fitness instructor,
yeah,
they teach you your form.
yeah.
They teach you, how to properly do
Like
the
the techniques.
exercise, the
Yeah.
techniques, all of that to address the muscles you need to use, all
Hmm.
of those things. But then you can't expect results just from going
Right.
once one time,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You still have to practice that
Yeah.
exercise routine at home. And so, yeah, kind of just looking at it that way, it's the same thing. You're kind of practicing on building your those like emotional muscles or like
Yeah.
the communication muscles, all of those things.
Yeah.
Another myth here too is that therapy is only talking. So
Right.
what is I guess your view of that myth?
Yeah. In that therapy session, there can be a fair amount of talking. I think that it's important the therapist, uh, our training helps us to pay attention to the amount of who is talking, what's being said, like the content, and trying to allow everybody in the room to be able to communicate as comfortably as they can. Uh, some of that is also what's not being said, right? And we're also trained to pick up on maybe the silences or, different pieces of body language and being curious about that. There are also more actionable items. I know we had talked earlier, different exercises that can be used in the therapy room, mirroring exercises, or like repeating back what your partner has said to you or what you've
Yeah.
interpreted them to be saying. Um,
I love the exercise that I think I was mentioning to you is I have my couple sit back to back
Mhm.
and then they have to communicate kind of like directions on a map or drawing out certain like shapes that are on the page, and it's so fun sometimes to have that. But it's also when you're trying to look at the communication in terms of trying to accomplish a task together, like let's copy this diagram or this, random shapes on this page. They're able to kind of see, they're able to kind of catch those patterns, like what was difficult about doing that, what frustrated you, you seem to get really frustrated at this part, why was that? And then
Totally.
you could kind of build that outside of this little activity or game
Yeah.
to be like, okay, how does that happen in your real world, right?
Yeah.
At home, all of that. But I also really appreciate you mentioning the physical nonverbal cues that happen, because yes, obviously while there's a lot of talking that happens in therapy, a lot of it is also curiosity, bringing awareness and attention to certain things. And so to be able to be like, oh wow, well, your body just shifted when your partner said this thing.
Yeah.
And they may pick that up, and that may trigger them to then respond a different way, or like, you rolled your eyes when your partner said this.
Yeah.
I can see that made them feel really frustrated. Like, you're bringing attention to these things. And so while it is talking, there's so much more than it just being like, words that we're saying. There's so much purpose to the conversations that we're having.
Well, a lot of times people don't understand that because it's outside of themselves, right? They're in that moment. And so I love as a therapist when I can point out, like, one partner is upset and really being able to point out that the other person moved closer or put their hand on their leg or their hand on their back, like just some of that, or like made eye contact or
reached out.
Like those connecting moments, right? Or conversely, if people are kind of withdrawing or moving over, and again doing that in a gentle way, but wondering what's going on with their nervous system, right? Why is there maybe alarm bell going off, and is whatever they're feeling, is that based on fact, or is that just based on like pre-existing experiences that have kind of been integrated in their nervous system, right? So they're being triggered, even though that's not what their partner's intentions were, right? I talk a lot about intention versus impact, and a lot of times what we're saying and doing in our relationships, the intention is genuine, but that doesn't mean the impact is going to be received how we're intending it to, right? And so that's important to look at and explore.
Yeah. So how would you suggest, or what advice can you give for couples who are wanting to start couples therapy? Like, how can they communicate that to their partner in a way? I think we touched very briefly on it, but yeah, what would be some suggestions or advice you'd give?
Yeah, I would say kind of timing is everything. So not mentioning it, mid-argument or when things are pretty conflictual. Like I said before, language is really important, and coming at it from a joining in, connecting, vulnerable place of, maybe I have some concerns. I'm sure you also have some concerns. I care about us. We don't seem to maybe being able to communicate that properly. Our relationship is really important. So I'm wondering, are we able to talk, to a counselor, to a therapist? I'm sure you can agree. A lot of times one person is a little bit more eager than another person. So, when I'm supporting individuals and they're wanting to look at couples counseling, I really recommend having, like I said, having that kind of conversation, depending on if their partner seems reluctant, really coming at it more curiously to see like what are they worried about, right? What are their thoughts or fears, or what are the barriers that's preventing that from happening? And then taking it slow and suggesting, could they look at a complimentary consultation somewhere? Just, it's short, 10, 15 minutes. A lot of places will even do them on the phone, which sometimes people feel easier just to get a little bit more comfort. Like fit is very, very important.
I think too, sorry to like add on that, it's sometimes when we are approaching our partner about therapy,
Mhm.
we might be going in already with a therapist in mind. And so our partner can feel like, oh, there that myth of like,
Right.
I'm gonna be ganged up on because now
Yes.
the therapist knows things
Right.
about me that
Yeah.
you've mentioned. And so, you know, having that fear. So really having that conversation of like, let's look for one together.
Exactly.
Or because you're initiating the conversation of having couples therapy, then maybe you allow your partner to be the one to do the searching and the finding
Yeah.
and the scheduling those consultations so that they feel like it's a good fit, especially if you know you've already had experience with
Mhm.
therapy, then maybe kind of giving your partner that flexibility of like let's find somebody that you feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
That can kind of ease, I don't know, it can kind of ease that partner into therapy when they're feeling a little bit more comfort with it.
Yeah. Having them, yeah, absolutely. Having them join in that process.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and again, really, it's about not making assumptions and checking in. What would make this more comfortable for you, right?
Yeah.
I know some people that I support, their partner ends up wanting to do individual first, just to kind of
Mm-hmm.
more like exposure therapy, getting into it.
Yeah.
I have a lot of people that I see over a period of time individually, and they want to do partners or couples counseling. And while I'm not going to necessarily do that, I have offered, do they want to sit in on 10 minutes of your session at the beginning or the end? They don't really have to say anything, just to get an idea, especially if
Yeah.
they have never had counseling. It can seem like it's really scary. So just to get them. So I've had a couple people do that, and then they found a couples counselor on their own. But yeah, I think that having them involved in as much of the process, making it really um, about supporting the relationship and to strengthen the relationship, to ask about, do they have any fears, do they have any concerns, asking about what would they want to talk about, what do
Yeah.
they, what are the strengths and maybe challenges that they're experiencing, right? Could be hopefully some of them are the same, but there might be some that are different as well.
Yeah.
Also checking to see there's different therapists, there's some different styles in terms of some therapists will only always see the couple together, which has lots of benefits. There are other therapists like myself where I see them together and then also separately, just because sometimes, I recognize that people will filter or don't always, they're afraid of hurting their partner's feelings, so kind of working on some of that stuff individually before coming back together. Figuring out, some couples I've supported that they only want to be together, and that's fair, but I think it's something when people are looking for a couples counselor to consider, right? What might work best for them individually in their relationship.
Yeah. And that's where the consultations can be so helpful, just to have more of an idea of the approach a therapist has.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's different styles. Gottman, they're really well known for their couples therapy. EFT, yeah, so emotionally focused. Yeah, a lot of therapists are doing obviously a eclectic or integrative approach, which is great because it depends. Sometimes different modalities work well at different times. So, but yeah, again, I think when we're broaching conversations in a way that is not combative or in the middle of conflict, and we're really clear on what our expectations are or what our hopes are for that work, it can take away some of the anxiety around taking that next step.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe like during a moment of conflict in your own mind, you're like, ooh, therapy could be helpful. Pocket it for time when you're feeling a little bit more regulated, and when you and your partner are in a good place, and then be able to bring up that conversation at that point. I think we've been talking a lot about couples therapy in terms of relationships and partnerships, but I think there's a lot of different types of couples therapy. I know there's been friends that have gone to couples therapy to either discuss life changes, if one friend is on a different kind of life journey than the other friend, kind of still wanting to stay in touch and communicate. And so coming to couples therapy to have a little bit of that understanding, or if there's
Mm-hmm.
been, a large conflict that maybe has happened in their friendship and they're
Mm-hmm.
wanting support through that to heal through that,
Mm-hmm.
friendship therapy can be really beneficial and helpful. So couples therapy, while traditionally for partners,
Right.
can also expand to friendships, to maybe family members,
Mm-hmm.
having sibling. While that would maybe be called family therapy, but
Right.
there is still like that connection.
Mm-hmm. It's still a relationship therapy
Yeah,
outside of traditional relationship therapy.
exactly.
Right. I know I supported a few years ago a fairly large sibling group living in kind of different areas in the province, and yeah, navigating, aging, some losses,
Yeah.
um, you know, kind of next stage of life. And yeah, it was pretty great, and they were really open in terms of, there had been like 3 or 4 siblings that it was hard to do that without a neutral third party to be able to, have a fair outline and helping them navigate.
Facilitate a
Yeah,
conversation.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's lots of different ways. I've supported some coworker situations. Um, yeah, there's really any kind of relationship that exists.
Yeah.
You're able to, and a lot of employers will also support that, especially if it's, causing some conflict or tension in the workplace. So I know we do
Yeah.
some of that at Clarity as well.
Yeah, and I think too, like co-parenting,
Oh yeah.
maybe the decision isn't so much to work on the relationship, but on how can you be good co-parents to each other, be on the same page when it comes to children. And so yeah, there's a lot of that, and there's also been, I guess, couples therapy still within partnerships, but maybe more as, let's go to couples therapy so that we can talk a little bit about how you can support me through an illness or through, a treatment that needs to be had. And so there can be, that conversation that can be sometimes like very emotional and bring a lot of that thing, like different things up for a partnership. But yeah, it can be, between
It's more individual, but bringing in situational and individual.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've had a number of clients where they've received diagnosis, and it's not that the relationship as a whole needs support, but it's around that particular, say, diagnosis or situation that's happening.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Same around treatment. It was a chemo treatment. And yeah, like, how can you support me? What do I need? What do I maybe need and won't communicate with you? Like, just, having like that safe space to figure out those expectations for one another while someone's going through a very vulnerable, difficult time. So there's so many different types of couples therapy. It's not just, around a partnership. You brought up an important point when we were talking about one of the myths where there are moments where couples therapy is not appropriate for a partnership. And so what are some of those moments where maybe that isn't an appropriate place?
Yeah, it's really not appropriate if there are pretty big power and control dynamics are existing in the relationship, um, including if there's been family violence or domestic violence or even emotional or psychological violence. That being said, it would be important for both of those people to have their own individual therapy. And then the reasons for that is there's a lot of evidence that when people historically have accessed services where there has been a big power differential or power imbalance, or there has been abuse happening, it can be used as a way to continue to manipulate or control the abused partner. So that's one thing. I would say if there's an ultimatum going on and someone really is not invested in the process at all, that could be harmful, definitely not helpful. There's a lot of obviously infidelity happens in a number of ways, whether it's emotional, physical, and lots of folks go to therapy for that, but it's not recommended if one person is still continuing on with that relationship, especially if the other person does not know.
Yeah. Or
Um,
thinks that it's ended.
exactly. Um, there are some therapists that will see couples if it's continuing, if there is it's kind of open knowledge, but I would say that it's kind of careful work that has to be done and somebody that's really skilled in that area.
Mm-hmm.
I would say when there are current addiction issues that are going on and the therapy isn't addiction related,
Mm-hmm.
again, you would need to be working with a therapist that has quite a bit of experience supporting couples where one or both are also struggling with addictions and
Yeah.
are aware of the impact of that. And the last one is if there are mental health issues or illnesses that are not diagnosed or not being treated.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, and again, especially if the therapist doesn't have a lot of experience in those areas, there can be a lot of instability and uncertainty. And, therapists, our whole motto is to do no harm and
Mm-hmm.
to move people forward in a healthy way. So,
Mm-hmm.
all of those issues can make it really challenging for therapists to be able to ensure that the therapeutic relationship is healthy and that everybody is supported in the way that they should be
Mm-hmm.
in light of those extra pieces that are going on as
Yeah.
well.
And I think sometimes, folks start couples therapy and then some of these things come to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be where your therapist recommends individual therapy for time.
Yes.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
I know it can be really hard sometimes because there's like, the feeling of rejection or,
Mm-hmm.
that your situation is, so challenging that a therapist can't work with it, but it really is to protect you
Yeah.
and your relationship. And so the suggestion of going to individual therapy is for your benefit.
Mm-hmm.
But the discomfort with that suggestion can definitely be discussed in couples therapy or with that therapist as you transfer into individual.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's a lot of different views of couples therapy. There's a lot of different feelings around couples therapy, but hopefully we help bust some of those myths to make you a little bit more comfortable to approach this style of therapy if that's something you're looking for. Is there any last thoughts that you want to share with folks on couples therapy?
No, I think it's great that I have a lot of younger couples that are reaching out for support, and again, I think that's great because I think again that dispels the myth that things have to be tanking, right? It's I think there's a lot more acceptance around accessing mental health services and supports, and I think the sooner that we are able, the earlier in life we're able to recognize how the families that we grew up in, have positively and maybe at a time sometimes have challenged our current relationships. The sooner we're able to integrate maybe some new ways of communicating and resolving conflict, then we're not dealing with them 40 years later when they're really deeply entrenched. So just checking it out and being curious and being open to hearing a different perspective and knowing that, it doesn't have to be a big deal. There's lots of different therapists with lots of different styles. Fit is really important. And, it's great that there are so many wonderful therapists that offer no cost consultations because fit is the most important piece of the therapeutic relationship. So just if you're feeling like it might be something to explore, a no cost consultation is a great way to check that out.
Yeah, just even to start it off, right? Yeah. I think also the one last thing I'm going to add is that sometimes couples therapy can be more long term when there is that preventative measure of having somebody that you trust, that you both trust, to be able to work towards your relationship. And sometimes it's situational. Like if an in-law is coming to live at home and you want a couples therapy on how to navigate that situation, it may be a little bit more situational for that moment. And so having that flexibility and the awareness of, doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a formative
Yeah.
end time, but
Great.
just, yeah, having somebody there that you can trust. So thank you so much again, Tanya. It's always so nice to have you here.
Yes.
You can find Tanya at.
Clarity Counseling and Mediation in Cambridge, the Galt area.
You can also find Tanya on social media at Clarity Counseling and Mediation. As always, you can follow us at Outside the Therapy Room Pod on Instagram. But yes, thank you again so much for having me here. Hopefully we get you back another time.
Absolutely. Have a great weekend.
Okay, bye.
Thank you for listening to Outside the Therapy Room. This podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you reside in Ontario and are interested in working with one of our therapists, please visit our website in the show notes. If you reside outside of Ontario, a quick Google search or search through Psychology Today will help you find a therapist near you.